Ok. Então, muito boa tarde a todas e a todos. Sejam mais uma vez bem-vindos e bem-vindas a mais uma sessão do evento Questões Ecológicas em Perspectiva Interdisciplinar. O nosso convidado de hoje é o professor Carl Cassegård, professor no Departamento de Sociologia e Ciência do Trabalho da Universidade de Gothenburg, na Suécia. A sua pesquisa decorre no campo da sociologia cultural e da teoria social, com particular enfoque nos movimentos sociais e na experiência da sociedade moderna, enquanto chocante ou natural, não responsiva ou como ambiente que podemos reconfigurar, e o modo como esta experiência é influenciada pela marginalização e pelo envolvimento em movimentos sociais e no ativismo. Recentemente tem-se interessado pela questão relativa ao que leva as pessoas a envolverem-se no movimento ambientalista, mesmo quando perdem a esperança na possibilidade de salvar o mundo. Os seus referenciais teóricos são o marxismo e a teoria crítica, e entre as suas muitas publicações tem os livros Shock and Naturalization, de 2007, Youth Movement, Trauma and Alternative Space in Contemporary Japan, de 2014, e Toward a Critical Theory of Nature, de 2021, que é basicamente o livro que nos traz aqui hoje, e atualmente ele pesquisa sobre o movimento ambientalista no projeto Adapting to Climate Change, Emotions and Narratives in the Environmental Movement. A sua palestra tem o título A Critical Theory of Nature. Dear Carl, thank you once again for accepting our invitation. The floor is yours.
Well, thank you for the invitation. I'm extremely glad to be here. I hope you can all hear me clearly. And
yes, perfect.
Great. So I will try to share a PowerPoint, and so please. I hope you can all see the PowerPoint. And as you can see, I've entitled my talk, The Reification of Nature and How to Resist It, Contributions of the Critical Theory of Nature. And let me explain what I want to talk about. Very much this talk will be based on the idea of what I call a critical theory of nature. So let me start by explaining what I mean by that. And I think that an outlook on the world today might be the proper place to start. Well, I think that philosophy should be for trying to orient oneself to the essential. And I think that looking out at the world today, what could be more urgent, more essential than to actually try to confront and also perhaps try to resist this appalling destruction that we are seeing today. I mean, the catastrophic extinction of species, the breakneck speed by which we seem to be heading towards a hothouse Earth, and perhaps above all, this seeming inability of us humans to break with this catastrophic logic, which seems to be inherent in the present economic system that we are inhabiting, even though we are all aware of the catastrophic consequences. An important thing that I think many of us are feeling today is that the apocalyptic disasters and catastrophes that environmentalists have long warned us about, they are not so much perhaps a future threat as in fact a reality that is engulfing us now already. So the problem becomes, I think, how we should relate on the one hand to this system that seems to be producing these catastrophes, and on the other hand to the catastrophes themselves and what they mean to us in terms of human suffering, and also when it comes to the suffering of nature, perhaps. So one big question is, why do the social forms that structure our relationship to nature, why do they appear so resistant to change? And this may appear like a paradox, especially in view of the presently popular notion of the Anthropocene, which is said to be an age in which human beings wield more power than ever before over the rest of nature. At the same time, in the Anthropocene, this idea of human might paradoxically goes together with an unprecedented sense of helplessness, I would say, in the face of these forces which human beings themselves have created. And I think that this paradox disappears when we recall that these immense powers that are referred to in the notion of the Anthropocene are not so much powers of humanity, but rather those of a second nature, namely capitalism. So human beings, on the one hand, I think, are perpetrators in this drama. That is true. But human beings are also, of course, victims of this system which they have created. So therefore, I would suggest that the primary conflict in which we perhaps are engaged is not so much between humans on the one hand and nature on the other hand, as between a capitalism that parades as second nature and on the other hand, a world, including both humans and non-humans, a world on which capitalism imposes its categories and forms. So then the question becomes how this system, with its forms and categories, can be criticized and resisted. And I will go to the next slide. And I have written a book where I try to show how such a critique might be possible. I try in this book to develop a critical theory of nature. And by that, I mean a theoretical approach that aims at a critique of the reified forms that regulate our interaction with nature. Now, this is a dense formulation, and I hope the meaning of it will become clearer in the course of my talk. One could ask, of course, what is the point of a critical theory of nature? Aren't there other approaches around that similarly attempt to criticize environmental destruction and capitalism? Yes, of course there are. So let me just very, very briefly try to indicate how the critical theory of nature is distinct. And on the one hand, and now I'm going to be very, very brief, but on the one hand, we of course have an important strand of eco-Marxist thinking, which I think is important and very inspiring. And on the other hand, we also have other approaches that are perhaps not as realist in terms of, reliance on natural science and so on, but rather socially constructivist. And in that sense, represent a different strand from eco-Marxism, constructivist, and I think that close to them, we can also point to strands, theoretical strands like new materialism and so on, that I think have also developed an interesting critique of many things in present society. And what I want to do, in my book, I engage in a kind of critical dialogue with these other strands, but my primary aim is, of course, not to criticize. I rather try to show why I think that room is needed in these approaches for a critique of reified forms or real abstractions. I will return to these terms later. And the relevant contradiction, I believe, is, as I said, not so much between society and nature, but rather between form and matter, to put it succinctly. On the one hand, between the reified forms of the system, and on the other hand, on the world on which they are applied. And form, I see as the principles that structure our relationship to matter. And matter, on the other hand, I think is important because it has the potentiality, the possibility of undermining forms. We can see that, I think, also in the present recurrence of big catastrophes. I think that is one of the primary manifestations of this phenomenon, whereby matter, in fact, can help undermine form. And this relation between form and matter is central to the critical theory of nature. Now, I will just briefly sketch the argument that I'm going to make today, and I'm going to start by describing a bit more in depth what makes the critical theory of nature special. And I'm going to do that by raising the question of materialism. In what sense is the critical theory of nature materialist? In connection with that, I will next turn to the question of reification, and I will raise the question of how can this term reification be applied to nature? Is it applicable at all? And why should we try to apply it to nature? This leads over to a third question. How can we conceive of a possible de-reification of nature? This is connected with the so-called Lukas problem, a recurring and much debated problem in Western Marxism and also in critical theory, in Frankfurt School thinkers and so on, who build on ideas around dialectics and nature that can be found in the Hungarian philosopher Georg Lukács. And fourthly, I will then try to show how a possible solution to this problem can be found in Theodor Adorno's idea of constellations, which is a special way of using concepts that try to do justice to experiences of non-identity. In order then to concretize how this can relate to actual resistance, I'm going to end by briefly mentioning some examples of recent environmental activism before concluding my talk. I will start with the question of critical materialism. And I would say that this is one of the things that most clearly bring out what is distinctive about the critical theory of nature. Critical materialism shouldn't be confused with the causal materialism and practical materialism that has dominated much of Marxist thought during the 20th century. And causal materialism, to start with that, is much associated with Engels, his idea of dialectics of nature, and also with so-called orthodox Marxism. Here, matter is conceived of as exerting a determinate causal force on the rest of society, the so-called superstructure. And nature is usually apprehended through the lens of natural science, and then a causalistic model of science is extended to the social world or the practical world of acting human subjects. To the extent that dialectics is being used at all, this is an objectivistic conception of dialectics that can easily be criticized for not leaving very much room for human agency and praxis. And this strand of materialism was famously criticized by Lukács and by other proponents of so-called Western Marxism, who instead developed what I call a practical materialism. In this materialism, the determining element, matter, is not so much a base that exerts external causal force on the rest of society, but rather an idea of historical totality, a larger totality in which human praxis is included, and in which human praxis also plays an active shaping role in determining the direction of historical change. While this form of practical materialism, it avoids, of course, the mechanistic causalism, the reductive quality of causal materialism, but on the other hand, it also leaves the relation between the world of praxis and nature somewhat obscure. And it is, in fact, doubtful whether this idea of a praxis-oriented dialectics can be applied to nature at all. So this leads over to critical materialism. And this is a certain form of materialism which I think is quite important to distinguish from the other two, perhaps more well-known forms of materialism. And it was developed in the Frankfurt School, above all, I would say, by Theodor Adorno. And it is a form of materialism that above all aims at critique. It takes the form of a so-called immanent critique that seeks to criticize the dominant categories of capitalism by taking the point of departure in the experience of non-identity. So this differs, I think, compared to practical materialism, this differs from practical materialism by a notion of totality that is negative. So unlike in Lukács and also unlike in Hegel, the idea of totality is not something with which one should identify in order to grasp the truth of the historical situation. Instead, it is something that is seen as false, as deceptive, and as something to criticize. Rather than being constituted of truth, this totality is the false, the whole is the false, as Adorno famously said. And what I have called second nature, this world of capital made up of reified forms, is such a totality, made up then of forms that are imposed on the systems outside, including humans as well as non-human nature. And here, in critical materialism, the material element is not really the economy, seen as a base, an identifiable base, but rather the outside on which the system depends, an outside that includes all the use values that the system requires, energy, resources, also human labor. And from the viewpoint of the system, this outside appears as the non-identical. It is non-identical to the categories and the forms that are used by the world of capital. However, there is nothing mysterious or ineffable about the non-identical. And if we shift standpoint from that of the system to the standpoint of our own experiences, then we can see that this non-identical thing, it appears also in a positive guise. If we read Adorno, for instance, this might come as a surprise to those who are used to seeing Adorno as a purely negative or critical thinker. But the non-identical also has a positive guise, I claim, in his writings. It comes forward as everything that the reified categories fail to do justice. To take an example related to environmentalism, there was nothing ineffable about the nuclear disaster at Fukushima in Japan in 2011. No matter how non-identical this might have appeared from the system, from the nuclear industry. And as this example shows, matter can indeed very effectively undermine form also. And this points to an important thing. Matter makes itself known through experiences such as shock and pain, suffering and dissonance, as Adorno points out. One could paraphrase Fredric Jameson, the literary critic, who says that history is what hurts. And one could similarly say that nature is also what hurts, or matter is also what hurts. So in this conception of materialism, nature is not so much a body of objective facts, but it is rather something that tends to destroy expectations, something that gives the lie to idealist pretensions. Adorno would, I think, agree. There is a saying of his, namely that the true is what does not fit in. And I think that that is another way of expressing this. So from the viewpoint of critical materialism, the environmental catastrophes that are saying, they are instances of shock, of pain and suffering that I think can be seen as this sensation of the non-identical writ large, in a sense. And as such, they affect a rupture in the self-understanding of capitalism, which I think is important both politically and methodologically for theorizing about what is happening. Because under conditions of reified thinking, these catastrophes and these shocks are a kind of negative impact of reality on our ideas. And therefore, I think that they are important objects for a critical theory of nature. I'm, of course, not claiming that only what hurts is real. That would be absurd. Surely a tooth that is real, a tooth is real even when it doesn't hurt, in the same way that nuclear power is real even when there are no accidents. But still, shocks and catastrophes have an important epistemological question as eye-openers that show the system to be false in its pretensions. Now, how does this relate to immanent critique? Adorno's negative dialectics is often described as immanent critique. But however, it should, I think, be evident from this methodological role of shock that his critique, his critical procedure is not really strictly immanent in the sense of being internal, wholly internal to the criticized system. Instead, it confronts the categories of the system with the non-identity between these categories and the objects that they aspire to cover. So, as Adorno points out, immanent critique, in fact, has a transcendent moment. And that is not in the sense that it relies on external conceptual yardsticks, which are applied to the critique, but it involves a transcendent moment in the sense of maintaining what he calls felt contact with the objects. In other words, a relation to experience, the experience of the object. And this, I think, follows from what he calls the primacy of the object, which is one of the important thoughts that are really central to his thought. The will to do justice to the non-identical and to the suffering and pain and shock that are central to my experience, they become a driving force for this immanent critique. They become a driving force or motor of what Adorno calls the logic of disintegration, that is negative dialectics. And the point I want to make here, I think the important point is that immanent critique, one shouldn't be misled by this term. One shouldn't believe that this is something that wholly only operates within the system. And instead, it is something that is, in fact, always drawing nourishment from experiences of the objects that concepts and categories and so on attempt to cover. And that, I think, is really central in order to understand this relation between reified forms and matter, reified forms and nature, because, and this is central to my presentation, this experience really needs to be the point of departure for the critique of the reified forms. The problem, however, then becomes, how are we to think of this relation between the system's categories and the non-identical? I will soon return to this question, but first I should have shown you this slide earlier, and I'm sorry, but hopefully you have been able to follow my argument anyway. Now, before discussing how to understand the relation between concepts and experience, I need to say a little bit more about the problematic but also highly useful concept of reification. So I'm going to turn to the question, what is reification and can this term be applied to nature? And what I have called a negative totality, this thing that is the target of critique, it is, I think, best understood as a system made up of reified forms. Now, this is not just a system of philosophy. It's not a purely mental construct. Unlike purely mental construct, these forms and these categories correspond to real domination. So they are rooted in what could be called real abstractions. Now that is, of course, a term associated with Alfred von Rethel, and which I think is also highly useful. And by real abstractions, he meant abstractions that are not only rooted in, our mental ideas, but above all, they are reproduced in praxis, and hence they come to structure social life regardless of whether or not we really believe in their validity. Now, to Lukács, reification, as I write here, is a process whereby historical creations come to appear as nature, as things that seem to possess their essence in themselves, irrespective of historical and social context. Now, as Lukács points out, reification is what makes society appear like a second nature. And this helps understand why the social forms of capitalism appear so resistant to change, so very hard to change. The problem with reification, however, is that it has been used and understood in very many different ways, and there are also certain unclarities in the way that Lukács uses it. So in order to show why I think that this concept is indispensable for the critical theory of nature, I want to make 3 clarifications. And the first has to do with, a popular understanding of reification which exists. And according to this understanding, reification is what happens when you treat human beings or human creations as if they were mere things, right? And this is not altogether wrong. However, I would argue that those thinkers who introduced the concept of reification, like Lukács, but also thinkers in the Frankfurt School, also thinkers like Ernst Bloch and so on, if you look at their writings, this opposition between human beings and things wasn't really all that central to them. Rather, it meant that an object, human or not, appeared to possess this essence or substance independently of the process of its historical mediation. So in this sense, one could say that even identifying a person as a human being in distinction to, say, animals or to things, would be an instance of reification. So reification then, to them, was not the opposite of the human, but rather the opposite of the historical. Reification is not to treat human beings or human creations as things, but to treat any aspect of the dialectically constituted world as a thing. The second clarification. Reification is sometimes seen as an inherent attribute of language or of conceptual thinking, and that is not how I use the term. I mean, I think that it would be absurd to say that language use that is, let's say, poetical or dialogical, or language use that belongs to oppressed groups is reifying, because in these cases, concepts very seldom have a crucial role in structuring social reality, social praxis. Instead, I would argue that it is only when concepts and categories become crucial to the reproduction of dominant institutions, dominant systems in society, it's only then that we can say that concepts become reifying. It's only then that I think that it's useful and meaningful to talk about reification. The third clarification is important, and it leads over to a problem that I will soon discuss. There is an ambiguity in how Lukács himself used the concept of reification. And this ambiguity can easily lead one wrong when one uses the term. Lukács himself primarily applied the concept of reification to how social relations were being transformed by capitalism and modern bureaucracy. And he also, especially in his early writings, tends to portray second nature as something that is artificial, while first nature is portrayed as truly genuinely natural. Now, as critics have pointed out, this appears to rest on a questionable ontology, a separation between nature and society, and it also risks leading to an understanding that reifying thinking is legitimate when applied to first nature, this natural world that is, so to speak, genuinely natural. And against this, what I think could be called anthropocentric understanding of the concept of reification, I want to stress that nature too can be reified. And I think that this extension of the concept of reification to nature, it goes very well with Marx's own analysis of capitalism. Because the real abstractions that are reproduced by capitalism, commodity fetishism, and so on, they do not just impose forms that are functional for the system on social interaction. They also impose forms for the processing of nature, or what Marx called the metabolism with nature, the metabolic exchange with nature. And this is systematic. This is necessary for capitalism, since nature is a source of use values and it also needs to be turned into a commodity. So I think that if you are really to theorize capitalism as a system of reified forms, then you must also allow for the fact that these forms are applied to nature, which would imply also that nature can be reified. Now, if nature can be reified, I think that this has interesting implications for the notions of first and second nature. It means that the distinction between these terms, it doesn't really concern the content of the two concepts so much as the manner in which they are approached. So what matters is not really whether the content is artificial or not, or natural or not, but whether it is reduced to aspects that are deemed relevant by dominant institutions in society or not. And with this interpretation, you don't have an ontological separation between society and nature. So instead of starting with this separation and then arguing that reification is illegitimate when applied to society, but not in relation to nature, reification itself becomes a kind of criterion for distinguishing between first and second nature. Second nature differs from first nature not by virtue of being artificial, but by virtue of being reified. So a forest, for instance, that is subjected to the market or commodified, it then becomes reified and it becomes second nature. Of course, it still remains in some sense material and hence also first nature, but even a natural thing can be reified. So this third problem, this third clarification, directly leads over to the so-called Lukas problem, which I'm now going to address. Now, according to Lukas, the task of dialectical thinking is to show that second nature, this world of reified thought, reified things, is in fact historical and therefore possible to change. However, ever since he published his major work, History and Class Consciousness, there has been a debate around whether he really thought that nature could be reified or not. If nature can be reified, then it should also logically be possible to de-reify it by dialectical thinking. On the other hand, it's possible to ask, isn't nature kind of naturally made up of things and hence impossible to de-reify? And the eco-Marxist John Bellamy Foster has referred to this dilemma as the Lukas problem, since he believed that it comes forward in an acute form in Lukas thinking. But he also, in a series of polemical remarks, makes clear that he thinks that this dilemma is a characteristic of much Western Marxist thought in general, including the Frankfurt School. And this problem arises because Lukács has this praxis-oriented conception of dialectics, which appears to require a restriction of dialectics to the domain of subjectivity on human praxis. But on the other hand, he has this general program of criticizing reification, which implies that critique should be extended also to nature and to natural science, the prototype of so-called bourgeois reifying thinking. Now, if dialectics is restricted to society, nature becomes a domain where dialectics is powerless to criticize reification. And Lukács sometimes, it's not entirely clear, but he tends to affirm that position, although there are statements in his work that indicate other interpretations. Now, this means that he appears to land in a form of dualism, according to which history and nature should be studied using different kinds of methods. And to use the terminology that I developed before, he methodologically becomes torn between, on the one hand, a causal materialism that is applied to nature, and on the other hand, a practical materialism that is applied to history. This problem has been much discussed. It started with Lukács himself and contemporaries such as Ernst Bloch, and it has been much discussed also in traditions of critical theory and eco-Marxist thinking and so on. And I believe that it's possible to identify at least 4 major responses and proposed solutions to this so-called Lukács problem. And the first one is to follow in the footsteps of Lukács and actually affirm this dualism of methods and defending him, defending Lukács and saying that he did the right thing. And this, I think, it's possible to argue like this, but this strategy, this proposed solution, then also requires a rejection, an abandonment of the goal to reify nature. Nature really becomes a domain where reifying thought, positivistic thinking, and so on is seen as legitimate and proper. There is a second solution which is associated with Foster himself, and that is to try to go back to Friedrich Engels and resurrect the old idea of an objectivistic dialectics that would operate in nature without the involvement of human actors. That too, I believe, has certain weaknesses, which I criticize in the book, although I will not delve further into them right now. To put it briefly, I mean, this, I think, involves a kind of movement towards a causal form of materialism and tends to involve an abandonment of the more praxis-oriented form of materialism associated with Lukács. And it also runs the risk of making dialectics into a kind of ersatz natural science that would then compete with natural science on its own turf. At least that is a tendency, which I think can be criticized. A third solution is to extend rather boldly, a rather bold move, but to extend the category of the subject to nature. Now, this can, of course, be done. You can see it among many thinkers in the tradition of critical theory. The problem becomes when you see this as a very, very wide-ranging category that no longer depends on the concrete relation between human beings and their experiences. And I think that you can see in Ernst Bloch how the universe, in fact, becomes imbued with subjectivity. And he has speculations about a nature subject, which very much, I think, can be seen as one attempt to escape the Lukács dilemma, because by extending the category of subject to nature, to the universe in this sense, it would then become possible to see the entire cosmos as suffused by a kind of dialectics. But the price to be paid for this is that the contact between human praxis and dialectics is also attenuated. It becomes rather unclear. And the fourth solution, which can be seen today, is that you push for a more thoroughgoing form of social constructivism. You can see this in Stephen Vogel, for instance. And that would also be one way of saying that nature, of course, is just as social as everything else, and hence we can apply a praxis-oriented, socially grounded dialectics to understanding nature. And objections then can be raised to all of these proposed solutions, but that doesn't mean that no solution exists. A satisfactory solution, I believe, does exist, and that is a solution that I think needs to preserve the possibility of deifying nature. And therefore, I will not go along with those who defend a dualism of methods or who try to reconstruct an objectivistic dialectics of nature. At the same time, I think that one needs to respect the fact that nature has an otherness. That means that nature cannot be reduced wholly to the category of the subject. It's only by seeing nature as possessing its own form of independent objectivity that it also makes sense to speak of a contradiction, I think, between concepts and the objects in nature to which they are being applied. So I want to retain that kind of contradiction, and that also makes me skeptical towards the attempt to drastically extend the subject category to nature. It also makes me skeptical towards very radical variants of social constructivism, because there, this otherness, this independence of nature tends to get lost. So there is a solution, I would argue, and you can see this in the Frankfurt School, especially in the idea of constellations, to which I soon will turn. But this solution only becomes visible if we shift towards the perspective of critical materialism. So this brings me over then to the idea of constellations, which I see as a very important piece, in fact, of Adorno's negative dialectics. It is only described in a handful of pages in Negative Dialectics. It's one of his central books. But still, I think that this idea of constellations as a way of using concepts that would break with identity thinking is something that follows quite naturally or logically, so to speak, from his central preoccupation with the object and how to respect what he calls the primacy of the object and the sensed non-identity that exists in our experiences of objects. So I want to stress the importance of this idea in Adorno, and that also means that I want to warn, in fact, against interpretations of Adorno that see him almost entirely as a negative or only critical form of thinker. There is, in fact, a positive side to his thinking, which derives from this idea of the primacy of the object, and which is expressed in his idea of constellations, because the constellations are crucial to him in his attempt to show that there is a way of using concepts that can, in some measure at least, do justice to our experiences of objects, and that breaks with identity thinking. And how is this possible? How can concepts do justice to the experience of non-identity? And here, I think one needs to start with Adorno's idea of objects, in fact. And I will not make this more difficult than necessary. And I think that the important thing is to remember that objects, they are not just physical things, and they are not just positivistic facts, and they are not mere sense impressions. So, for instance, if you read Adorno, you can see that he treats things as objects like, for instance, childhood memories. You can see that art is being treated as objects. But I think we can also extend this and say that when we have an understanding of, let's say, a pollution incident or some other form of environmental catastrophe, then that could also constitute an object in Adorno's sense. And if we try to understand what we mean by that kind of objects, let's say a phenomenon like climate change or mercury poisoning, for instance, or a pandemic, then we can all see that these have a very peculiar relation to concepts. The understanding of these objects is always mediated by concepts. So we need then various forms of concepts in order to understand them. And when it comes to these phenomena, of course, we need scientific concept. We need, we also need economic charge. We need court proceedings, perhaps, and the experiences of victims, and much more. So we need concepts, and these concepts need to come together in a way that, in a way that shows how these concepts all contribute to this understanding that I have of the object. And that means that I need to bring together concepts that are not necessarily compatible with each other. So I have a rather heterogeneous collection of concepts that I need to resort to in order to understand a certain kind of object. There is a contradictory quality to this gathering together of concepts. And that is because there is always this experience that I try to express through them that is contradictory in itself. It is part of a reality that is torn, in fact, between what is happening, this relation between dominant systems that are causing pain and suffering in the real world. And let me take an example, the history of Minamata disease, the most famous instance of mercury poisoning in the world. And if I look at that, then I can see that my understanding of Minamata disease, it is something that necessarily, when I try to account for it, I must account for this by, of course, medical accounts, but also scientific accounts. But in addition to that, I need to resort to famous historical things that color my the meaning which I attach to Minamata disease, such as dancing cats, poisoned cats that dance, right? Dead fish, long struggles in court, the famous incidents of the protest movement, the disruption of shareholder meetings by desperate fishermen, for instance, and also the aftermath, survivors, people who mourn the dead by carving Buddha statues. All of these things, all of these historical experiences have by now, thanks to history, become part of my understanding of the object, Minamata disease, and hence I must try to seek to do them justice when I describe this phenomenon. And what is really important is that this juxtaposition of different elements, it doesn't produce a unified picture, because what is important to me is not to arrange these conceptual elements in a logical form that is internally consistent. That is not my main point. My main point is to try to do justice to my experience of the object, to my understanding of what Minamata disease was. And that means that I always need to bring together these elements, even if they are mutually contradictory. Otherwise, I would end up with what I would feel would be a one-sided and hence badly abstract view of what happened. An understanding that would leave out essential parts of my understanding of Minamata disease. And this juxtaposition of heterogeneous elements, that is what Adorno calls the constellation. And as he explains, constellations, they aim at bringing out non-identity. And rather than subsuming the object, the conceptual elements in a constellation, they, he writes, encircle it by a plurality of elements that needn't be logically connected to each other. And this is something that he expresses in this quote that you can see here to the right. They encircle the concepts like in a plurality. So what's important here is that a constellation prioritizes the capacity to illuminate the object over the internal logical integrity of the conceptual system. So what holds the constellation together is this ability to illuminate the contradictory character of the object. It's not logical consistency, but the capacity to illuminate contradiction or non-identity. Adorno himself doesn't write much about natural science, and he also confesses not to have any expertise in that field. However, there is nothing, he also states that prevents him from actually using natural science in constructing these forms of constellations. Natural science, he writes, is important in order to break with the idealistic pretensions of other systems of thought. So nothing, I would say, prevents small parts, bits and chunks of scientific knowledge from being used in a constellation. And again, Minamata disease, climate change, and so on, I think all of those are good examples of that. I really cannot dispense with science if I am to account for the meaning of these objects. I need science. Otherwise, important parts, essential parts of the meaning of these things, these objects, would disappear. So thinking dialectically, it doesn't mean that you do like Engels, that you try to do the work of natural science. Rather, dialectics is more about how to insert these bits and chunks of natural science in a constellation in a way that is useful and illuminating for, bringing out what I feel to be the essence of a certain object. And this way of thinking in constellations, I think that this has many advantages. It is, I think, certainly preferable to a rigid dualistic separation between nature and society, with each realm possessing its own proper method. And using this idea of constellations and this idea of dialectics as that is connected to the idea of constellations, where you have concepts that mutually determine each other, that come together in order to illuminate different aspects of an object. I think that this is dialectics. It derives from Hegel, and the way Hegel says that you need to proceed in this way to make an understanding the meaning of an object concrete. That is a Hegelian idea. And Adorno stands out by the stress he puts on the fact that this essence, this meaning that objects have, is contradictory and suffused by non-identity. But the procedure in itself is very, very Hegelian. So I would say that here we have a form of dialectics that is very, very different from what you find in Engels and causal materialism. It's also very different, I would say, from the dialectics of Lukács and what you can find in Lukács's practical materialism. And I think that this means that that when you have this form of dialectics, it shows how you can think dialectically about nature without having to, without having to resort to an objectivistic conception of dialectics or leaving the relation to nature unclear, as in Lukács. The important thing here is that constellations, I think, become a way for critical theory to make use of scientific knowledge, even if this might appear to be reifying forms of knowledge. I think that it can be included since the overall effect of a constellation is de-reifying, because no element in a constellation can assert itself as absolute. You cannot reduce the understanding of the object to any one of the conceptual elements that has gone into a constellation. You need them all. And this, I think, means that there is no reason to restrict them to reifying critique to human affairs. I think that this opens up for a critique that aims at a de-reification of nature. Right, and yes, again, this more or less is things that I should already have shown you, but I hope you were able to follow my argument anyway. So I will then move on to some examples of recent examples of environmental activism in order to make the description of how constellations can function to resist reification a little bit more concrete. Now, there is an apparent inability of environmental movements to be effective. I think that this is something that many of us feel. Despite decades of protest, climate change is going on, resources are being depleted, there is a seeming mass extinction going on, and the decades of protest seem to have had very, very little effect in stopping these disastrous processes. And this, I believe, contributes very much to this general feeling of helplessness that we can sense has become part of this notion of the Anthropocene. And to some measure, I think that this failure to be effective is a result of the fact that reified categories are reproduced in environmental movements themselves. And this can be most clearly seen in eco-modernist strands of environmentalism, but it can also be seen in mainstream environmental organizations in general. You can see it in the uncritical attitude to capitalist markets, to so-called green technology, technocratic governing, and also in this general unwillingness to question ideas of green growth and in the reliance on established political and juridical categories. However, there are also instances of activism that seem to be centrally propelled by a desire to break with reification. And in these instances, you can see that often, rather than adhering to this general idea of progress or expansion and so on, or growth, often the experience of catastrophe is being central to the movement. And to take just two examples that I mentioned before, the nuclear catastrophe in Fukushima and Minamata disease, we can see that both of these triggered protest movements, in fact, mass protest movements. They had tremendous force, and they actualized a host of different demands related to different conflict lines in society. All of these demands touched on aspects that were felt to be absolutely essential, and they were quite right, I think. Things like health, things like class, things like the quality of democracy in Japan, the collusion between industry and bureaucracy, and the treatment of workers, the responsibility of scientists, and so on. So I think that in these cases, you can see how the movement, in its very way of organizing, in fact, tends to adopt a kind of constellative model, the movement and the different demands coming together to form a kind of constellation, and all being united at the same time in addressing the same kind of object, being united by an overall feeling of solidarity. And we can also see, secondly, how activists in some groups appear to adopt constellative modes of thinking precisely in order to try to make better sense of the novel character of today's predicaments. And these networks, these groups, often they explicitly try to problematize the established models of linear progress and growth. And you can see this, I think, in emerging networks of groups such as the Collapsology network in France, all still very marginal. Similar networks also exist in other countries, like, for instance, the Deep Adaptation Network and also activists organized around the Dark Mountain Project in the UK. There are also similar groups in Sweden where I am active and so on. And here you can see this attempt to rethink fundamental assumptions about present-day life in the light of collapse. You see activists who are driven by this lack of adequate categories for this coming era of hardship, and also by a desire to mourn ongoing or inevitable losses. And finally, there is also activism that very consciously and polemically highlight non-identity as part of their critique of existing institutions. And here, I think that one example that is very illuminating is that of the international tribunals for the rights of nature. Now, these are mock tribunals set up by activists. They lack legal force, although they adopt many of the trappings of, so to speak, real courts. And they are closely linked to the struggles of indigenous peoples and the idea of the rights of Mother Earth. If you look at the cases being treated in these mock tribunals, they often relate to catastrophes that have already happened, to ongoing suffering, and so on. It can be about polluted water, deforestation, oil spills, and also murdered activists. Now, I would say that part of this polemical force that these tribunals have, it stems from the fact that even while the tribunals mobilize this entire apparatus of legal courts, they do so from the point of view of a non-existing court. There is no such institution in society that could uphold the rights of Mother Earth or the rights of nature. So in this mock tribunal, the rights of nature, they are upheld. But since this can only be done through a non-existing system, the existing system of rights is then condemned and destabilized. You could say that the kind of ambiguous relation that is highlighted here, a relation of non-identity, I would say, is similar to what thinkers like Walter Benjamin or Jacques Derrida point to when they distinguish between established legal rights and the emphatic idea of justice, which is never entirely realized, but which always transcends and goes beyond the existing institutions. Yes, so I'm now going to say a few final words, and I have described how the critical theory of nature, it takes aim at a system of real abstractions, second nature, negative totality, and so on. All of those are terms that I use for this target of criticism. And the critical theory of nature, it tries to conduct this criticism by holding on to experienced non-identity, to experienced contradictions that arise between the system and the world around it, which includes nature, both in the sense of human nature, but also non-human nature. So the procedure here is immanent critique. This critique is not wholly internal to the system, as I have said, but it always refers back to this experience of non-identity and contradiction. And this critique is possible because we are never entirely engulfed by the system. We are always placed, so to speak, at an intersection where we ourselves experience this contradiction between the system and the world around it. We ourselves are part of that conflict and that contradiction. We ourselves are, at least in part, participating in this nature, this world on which the system imposes its forms. So the concept, or so the problem then becomes how to give voice to this feeling of contradiction or non-identity. In other words, how can we use concepts as part of critique in such a way that they do justice to this feeling of non-identity, that they give justice to what we feel is happening to this outside. And I have argued that Adorno's idea of constellations helps us to accomplish this. Constellations is a way of using concepts that avoids reification, since it tries to do justice to the experience of contradiction. In constellations, concepts are used in a way that prevents them from becoming absolute. And de-reification then, it doesn't mean that we stop using concepts. It means that we try to use concepts in a way that opposes, that resists this dominant system. And here I think that we should do as Adorno, we should pay attention to experiences, because that is where we can find this starting point of critique. So as I said before, shocks, pain, and suffering have an importance that is both epistemological and political. And the catastrophes around us, I think that they are an instance of that. They must also be part of this starting point of critique. So that is actually the end of my talk. And I'm sorry, I'm now seeing that I have probably spoken a little bit too long. My apologies.
No, it's okay. It's okay. Thank you, Carl. It was brilliant. We are now open to questions, and you can write them in the chat while people think. I will ask some questions of my own, or at least one question. You at the end of your talk, you hinted at some institutions of non-identity, these tribunals for the rights of nature as examples of institutions of non-identity, of giving voice to the feeling of contradiction and non-identity. Do you see them as being able of finding a place within the system, or within the political system, for instance? How can we, do you see a manner through which we can really institutionalize these gatherings and make them more binding within the system, their deliberations more binding within the system?
That is a large question. I personally think that certainly small steps can be taken towards realizing that, but can it be institutionalized on a larger scale? I think that would require an overhaul of the system. I think it would require a very different kind of society that is not that has also, I think, managed to escape this logic that I associate with capital, with the second nature of capital. But of course, one can. I mean, one thing that I think is important to remember is that this system of second nature, it is never absolute. It is never totally dominant. As I said, there is always contradiction, and that you can see is also being stressed by Adorno. There is this, image of Adorno as holding on to an image of society as being totally controlled, the totally manipulated, the totally administered society. But I think that if you read his formulations, in most cases, he qualifies this and said that, we are perhaps heading towards it, or this kind of society is in the process of being established and so on. but he's never really giving up the idea that contradictions still exist. And the very idea, I think, of negative dialectics is to search for such contradictions. If contradictions had disappeared totally, then there would, of course, be no non-identity and nothing to take one's departure from when it comes to critique. So I would say that it's quite difficult to institutionalize, let's say, more egalitarian forms of deliberation and so on in the system. But we can try to relativize the system by contesting it and by creating oppositional forces to it. And in that sense, movements can have a de-reifying effect because they can create situations where the dominant categories are not longer dominant. They can create situations where the dominant categories become contested. And in that situation of struggle, alternatives can appear. That is possible, but that is something else than institutionalization.
Okay, then you see the environmental movements and movements such as the environmental movements as more of disruptive forces than constructive forces.
Well, movements, as I said, are also ambivalent. I mean, much of the environmental movement is in fact quite close to institutionalized actors in society. So I would say that there are cases, there are instances in the environmental movement when it does become this countervailing force that can create these situations of instability where de-reification can happen. Certainly, yes. But there are also strong tendencies within the environmental movement towards an institutionalization, towards becoming more merged with the mainstream of society. And you can see this also when it comes to the idea of the rights of nature, right? Because on the one hand, you can see these activist manifestations where the idea of the rights of nature is used polemically. There, I think that you have a typical movement use, a typical activist use of the rights of nature. It is used to highlight contradiction. But at the same time, you also have, as part of this movement, attempts to institutionalize rights for nature. It becomes written in constitutions, but also if one looks here at Sweden, where I'm active, there is a rather active and well-known movement that actually aims at, juridically establishing rights of nature in connection with the idea of ecocide. And this is also done in the EU. So this is an ambivalent, notion. On the one hand, the rights of nature stands outside the system, polemically condemning the system. But on the other hand, there is also a rather strong push towards actually institutionalizing these rights. Yeah.
I see. We have William would like to ask you a question. William, go ahead.
It's not much of a question. It's much of I don't know. I'm making a few connections. I don't know if you're aware of Professor Hartmut Rosa's work, Professor Carl. He has a book about resonance theory, and he's also a critical theorist. And he also does work with a very experiential concept, resonance, that he focuses as an experience that we all share with objects, with nature, with each other in social aspects. So his theory is also, it has two parts. It's an acceleration diagnosis and resonance as a key aspect of social life, a social ontology. So in resonance theory, we have also a deep-seated contradiction. We have humans seeking resonance and a escalatory, reifying, institutionalized relations that just promote more reified movements in your terminology. So that's part of his work, and also within the aspects of nature, not only in social aspects and institutional and workspaces. So he's very broad in his approach. I don't know if you work with that, and in your work is mostly tied with Adorno, right? And he works mostly with Charles Taylor, maybe Honneth. So that's most of his heritage within critical theory.
Yeah, okay, thanks. Thanks for recommending this book. I must confess that I haven't read Resonance. I have it, in fact, on my shelf. I have read certain pieces by Rosa before. I think that they are interesting, but they haven't struck me as dealing so much with nature, but perhaps I should look further into it and have a look. I'm not sure that I can say much that, apart from that, since I haven't read him, but I do want to stress then that, yes, I am very much influenced by Adorno, by Lukács, and perhaps Benjamin, above all. I once used to be quite influenced by Habermas, and I think that there are still useful things in the way in his views of language. And I also try to sketch a little bit how you can combine, in fact, his idea of language and Adorno's idea of a reconciliation with nature. How can these two ideas be put together? And I think that one way of doing that is trying to extend the dialogical relation, in fact, from human interlocutors to also nature, to non-human interlocutors. When it comes to more recent critical theory, I should probably look closer into it, but I have shied away from it a little bit because I feel that they have left earlier critical theory behind to a rather large extent. Rather, a typical example would be Axel Honneth, where I can see a tendency towards stressing, let's say, the, ethical aspects, to put it simply, aspects of the good life. And this also goes for Charles Taylor, Rachel Yegi, and so on. They have, I think, interesting things to say about the good life, alienation, reification, and recognition, and so on, but often the relation to systems, larger systems, oppressive systems, becomes rather unclear. Now, I know, of course, that Honneth writes about this, but often still the relation between the way he uses certain concepts and, let's say, systems of capitalism becomes very unclear. Especially, I would say that when it comes to reification, for instance, he has, I think, an interesting book, but I disagree very much with his understanding of reification. I mentioned the three clarifications, right, that I want to make when it comes to this concept, and on many of these points, I see, in fact, him as having chosen the opposite understanding of reification compared to me. So that is one point of disagreement. But I will look closer into Rosa. I mean,
I will. I think it's probably maybe just curiosity, even if such, because he does have a specific part that he calls the voice of nature, which I did present it in this seminar. So it is very interesting because he delves within how the discourse of nature is part of modernity, and this idea of voice of nature is part of how we connect to nature. Because resonance is something that it's something that can affect you and you're affected, but it's only if you're separate, if you have a quite of distance. Yeah. So it's part of modernity, but if you get too detached, or if the relations get too reified, too alienated, then it becomes problematic. Then your relation with nature is through dominance. Well, I will try to go to the highest mountain. I will dominate the sea. So that's kind of the idea. And as to make something of this voice of nature, how to connect it and try not to dominate it. So it's very kind of interesting.
Extremely interesting. I will read this because I didn't discuss it today, but in my ongoing research, I look into groups that actually, I mean, in daily practice, use nature, the contact with nature, in fact, to kind of regulate hope. I mean, they are environmental activists, but of course they see all these catastrophes, and in many cases, they have what I call a post-apocalyptic view of the world. In other words, they see catastrophe as being already here or as inevitable. So the question then becomes, how can they uphold some form of hope or sense of meaningfulness in their activities? And one way in which they do this is by engaging with nature. I mean, they have long descriptions. I mean, when I interview them about their contact, I mean, the real physical contact with nature. And I could imagine that the idea of resonance might be useful when trying to understand that kind of relation. So yeah, thank you for that. And I will finally get a good reason then to read Resonance.
Thank you. Yeah, it's a thick book. Thank you. I will have, I think there are no more questions, so I will ask the last one and then I will let you go. Your account of reification is well, it's at the center of your argument, and you see reification always as some kind of domination. But what I am struggling to deal with is the fact that we can also make things that don't actually, they are reified, they are things in themselves, but they do not have that effect of instrumentalizing human relations. They have the opposite effect. I'm thinking of works of art, for instance. They are constructs that have the opposite effect. They bring people together. They intensify our experience and provide a subject for meaningful discussion, at least. And that is related with one question regarding capitalism. If you see that capitalism is of course the overwhelming force in all this, but how do you see our relationship with technology, for instance, beyond capitalism? Because technology isn't going anywhere, and its basis is reification, in a sense, instrumentalization. So how do you see our relationship, even with the constellations as resources? They will eventually have to settle on something. So how do you see? I don't know if my question is clear, but how do you see our relationship with technology and its reifying effects beyond beyond capitalism? If you see it beyond capitalism, or if it might be intrinsically related with capitalism.
Oh, that's two great questions. Let me start with art. Yes, well, like activism, of course, there are forms of art that conform to established categories and where you can see reifications. But I would say that in general, when art most emphatically functions as art, in other words, where, as you describe it, people maybe gather around it in order to discuss it because they cannot make sense of it and they need to talk and, you know, try to find what is interesting about it. In such cases, I would say that here you have an example of a use of concepts that is not reifying. There is Kant, right? Kant and his in his critique of judgment, he describes what happens when people approach art and things that are felt to be beautiful. And what happens is that you have the power of the imagination then, because you have this experience and you search for a concept that fits it. And you don't know which concept it is, so you put into play your imagination in order to find the concept that will apply to it. And he says that, yes, I must always engage in these concepts and I must always behave like, you know, I have this fixed opinion about the work of art as if it was something that adhered to the object itself, even though I realize that this is something subjective. And that is connected then to intersubjectivity and the fact that people come together and actually discuss it and so on. But I think that, I mean, of course, one shouldn't rely only on Kant, but I would say that this way of using concepts, I think that this cannot be called reifying. It's a non-reifying way of using concepts. But you can probably find counterexamples. And technology, yes. There is a long debate, of course, around this, and of course, the question really becomes burning when one imagines how would life be in a post-capitalist society, and I think that if we imagine a post-capitalist society, then that would be a society where the overall determining imperative is no longer the creation of value, right? So I think that we will have instrumental reason, we will have instrumental action, we will have to make use of the use values of nature, but it will not necessarily be, you know, employed in the context of this system, which is, you know, whose logic is the logic of capital accumulation. So here is, I mean, there is certainly an ambiguity here in critical theory, because the Marxist categories, value and so on, they often become obscured. Adorno and Horkheimer, they talk about instrumental reason, and that is such a broad term that it seems to include also the kind of exploitative dominant relationship that would exist in a post-capitalist society, right? I think that this was probably done because they felt, on the one hand, that in mature capitalist societies, there were other relations of oppressions than those that were purely economical. So you had the state, for instance, the bureaucracy, and also you had what happened in Russia, where the situation was awful, despite the seeming abolition of the profit motive. So they needed some kind of term for that. And I think that on the one hand, they were right in criticizing bureaucracy and in criticizing the Soviet Union. But on the other hand, they didn't deal properly with this burning issue that you are raising, namely, how then should we imagine a better utopia? One where you don't have the value, the imperative of creating value, and of course we could imagine that kind of society, but then of course the question arises, okay, so how about that other bad thing, bureaucracy, Stalinism, and so on? In this future post-capitalist society, how should we imagine a relation to nature that also escapes the ills of bureaucracy and, and so on? And I don't think that, that is still something that should be given more thought. I mean, there are important hints, certainly. If one, there are formulations in Adorno, there are formulations in Benjamin, and Marcuse engages, of course, in this question. But again, even in Marcuse, who is probably the critical theorist who tries to deal mostly with this question, this issue is a bit obscure. I mean, he talks about a new science and a new technology, but it's not clear what the new science or the new technology is, I think. So this is a difficult question. To make it easy for myself, I could answer like this. In a post-capitalist society, there would be no system that would force us to destroy nature. People would have to come together, and form these free associations where they would have to discuss and decide together what to do with nature. And if we are lucky, people will be reasonable and try to not harm nature. But I think that even in such a society, we cannot prevent human beings from ravaging nature if they decide to do so. So, but there will be no system that forces them to do so.
Yeah, kind of an open-ended result, let's say, against the more deterministic view of of previous views on the subject of political liberation and so on. It's a more open-ended.
Very open-ended. I'm sorry about that.
Yeah. No. I don't think it's a fault of the of your argument or the view. I think it's a virtue of the thing, because it's related to freedom and to the kind of open-endedness of all these spontaneous movements, including the environmental movement. We don't know where we are going, but we want something different. So I think it's brilliant. Yeah.
I know that Marcuse once got this question, what would people do in a liberated society? And then he answered by saying that then they would, for the first time, be free to think about what to do.
Yeah, exactly. Carl, I want to thank you once again for your kindness and in accepting our invitation. Your talk was brilliant, as is your book. Thank you very much. And I hope we'll talk again regarding your paper on our future ebook. But I hope to hear from you again, and we will have certainly the opportunity to hear you talk about related subjects on future talks. Thank you very much.
Well, let me thank you. I'm very grateful that you invited me, and I enjoyed talking, and I also enjoyed preparing for this speech very much. And I also hope we will have more occasions in the future to discuss Hannah Arendt, Hartmut Rosa, liberation, perhaps even. So thank you.
Thank you. Goodbye, all. Have a nice end of the week. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.